The 10,080th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is threats to international peace and security. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Cuba, Mexico, Nicaragua, Paraguay, and the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Mr. Khaled Kiari, Assistant Secretary General for the Middle East, Asia, and the Pacific, Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs and Peace Operations, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I would like to remind everyone that this is an official meeting of the UN Security Council, being fully aware that today's briefing is not an easy one. For anyone in the room, I would like to particularly remind all participants and speakers at today's discussion to engage in this meeting with utmost respect and to observe appropriate standards of tone, wording, and content in their remarks. I now give the floor to Mr. Khaled Kiari.
Thank you, Mr. President, Excellencies. The United States military presence and operations in the Southern Caribbean off the coast of Venezuela have increased since this Council last discussed the situation on 10th of October, further heightening tensions between the two countries. The United States described its military deployment as part of a, quote, non-international armed conflict, end quote, against drug cartels and drug trafficking, invoking Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations. President Donald Trump has stated that he is going to use the full power of the United States to take on and eradicate these drug cartels, no matter where they are operating from. The Venezuelan government, including its permanent representative, has described the measures by the United States as a serious threat to international peace and security. Most recently, in a letter dated 16 December and addressed to the President of the Security Council, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Venezuela asserted that the United States is violating the principle prohibiting the threat or use of force in international relations. Mr. President, U.S. strikes on vessels alleged to be illegally carrying drugs in the Southern Caribbean Sea and the Eastern Pacific have continued. According to United States authorities, 105 individuals have been killed in these strikes since 2 September. Officials have stated that the strikes have taken place in international waters or in the Southcom area of responsibility. The exact locations of these incidents have not been disclosed. In a statement on 31st October, the High Commissioner for Human Rights said that the airstrikes by the United States of America on boats in the Caribbean and the Pacific, allegedly linked to drug trafficking, violate international human rights law. The High Commissioner added that countering illicit trafficking of drugs across international borders is, as has long been agreed among states, a law enforcement matter governed by the careful limits on lethal forces set out in international human rights law. He called for prompt, independent, and transparent investigations. Mr. President, in late November, President Nicolas Maduro and President Trump held a telephone conversation. On 24th November, the United States designation of the Cartel de los Soles as a foreign terrorist organization entered into force under U.S. law. Subsequently, the United States imposed additional measures against organizations and individuals it alleges are linked to these activities. On 29 November, President Trump declared that the airspace above and around Venezuela should be considered closed in its entirety. This followed an alert issued by the US Federal Aviation Administration a few days earlier, warning major airlines of a potentially hazardous situation when flying over Venezuela. Since then, most international airlines have suspended or canceled flights to and from the country. Venezuelan authorities have described this as an attempt to impose an air blockade. The International Civil Aviation Organization issued a statement on 1st of December recalling that, and I quote, Article 1 of 1944 Convention of International Civil Aviation recognizes that every state has complete and exclusive sovereignty over the airspace above its territory, end of quote. The statement further noted, and I quote, any state can issue any information to its own operators regarding risks for flights over or in proximity of any geographic zones, including of another state, end of quote. On 10 December, tensions increased further when President Trump announced that the United States had seized an oil tanker off the coast of Venezuela, stating that the government of Venezuela was using oil to finance criminal activities. He also declared that, and I quote, the Venezuelan regime has been designated a foreign terrorist organization under United States law and ordered the total and complete blockade of all sanctioned oil tankers going into and out of Venezuela, end of quote. Subsequently, the United States authorities imposed sanctions on 6 shipping companies operating in Venezuela's oil sector and 6 vessels allegedly associated with these companies, which the U.S. claims have engaged in deceptive and unsafe shipping practices. Venezuelan authorities described these actions as a unilateral naval blockade. In identical letters dated 17 December and addressed to the Secretary General and the President of Security Council, the permanent representative of Venezuela stated that the U.S. actions violate Venezuela's national sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence. The letter further asserted that the naval blockade imposed unilaterally constitutes a violation of international law. In recent days, reports indicate that the Venezuelan Navy has been escorting ships departing its ports with petroleum products. On 20 December, the United States interdicted another tanker off the coast of Venezuela that was transporting oil from Venezuela. According to a United States announcement, the vessel was suspected of carrying oil subject to sanction under U.S. laws. On 20 December, U.S. Coast Guard pursued a 3rd oil tanker off the coast of Venezuela. Reportedly, the ship did not submit to boarding during the attempted interdiction and continued sailing away from the Caribbean Sea. U.S. actions have received support from some regional allies, but other member states within and beyond the region have voiced concern over the militarization of the Southern Caribbean and stressed the importance of respecting national sovereignty and international law. Several member states have echoed call for de-escalation and dialogue to address ongoing tensions. Mr. President, Excellencies, in September, citing external threats, President Maduro enacted a decree expanding the government's emergency powers. Public life has become further militarized, while Venezuelans continue to face serious human rights concerns and socioeconomic challenges. The UN Human Rights Office reported coerced enlistment into the Bolivarian militia, including adolescents and older persons. The High Commissioner has also reported on sweeping restrictions on freedom of expression and peaceful assembly, arbitrary detention and enforced disappearances, as well as acute social and economic strain. He called for an immediate end of enforced disappearances, incommunicado detention, and unauthorized transfers of detainees to unknown locations. The High Commissioner further reiterated the disproportionate impact of broad sectoral sanctions on Venezuela's most vulnerable populations, noting that these measures also hinder the work of human rights and humanitarian organizations. He called for the sanctions to be reassessed and lifted. Venezuela's economy was already extremely fragile, with soaring inflation, currency instability, and widespread income erosion. millions are unable to meet basic needs. Recent air and maritime restrictions, along with reduced exports, risk further constraining the government's fiscal ability to deliver basic public services. As the humanitarian situation deteriorates, the United Nations and its partners continue to work and deliver assistance in support of the Venezuelan people, including through recent financial allocations of the United Nations Central Emergency Response Fund and the Venezuela Humanitarian Fund. Mr. President, on 17 December, at his request, President Maduro held a telephone conversation with the Secretary General. The Secretary General reaffirmed the United Nations position on the need for member states to respect international law, particularly the United Nations Charter, exercise restraint, and de-escalate tensions to preserve regional stability. The Secretary General stands ready to support all efforts at diplomatic engagement, including the exercise of his good offices, if both parties so requested. He welcomes initiatives by member states, offers for mediation, and proposals for peaceful solutions. Dialogue is the only viable path toward lasting peace and preventing further instability and human suffering. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Mr. Chiari for his briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, we wish to thank Khaled Kiari for his briefing. For several months now, the entire world has had the opportunity to observe the way that the United States has been continuing to deliberately foment tensions around the friendly nation of Venezuela under the pretext of combating drug trafficking and the terrorist threat. Illegally destroying at the same time the civilian vessels in the Caribbean Sea. We, during the previous Security Council meeting, we all had an opportunity to see the fact that this artificial smoke screen is concealing the goal of U.S. military groups being shored up and the delivery of exerting tension on an independent state whose policy is not to the liking of Washington.
It seems that the White House decided to remove from the mothballs the previously embraced practice of portraying combating terrorism as justification for blatant aggression and intervention in the affairs of sovereign states. And this time, the so-called foreign terrorist organization has been labeled as being the legitimate government of the Bolivarian Republic. Their attempts to convince us all of the mendacious view that decision of the U.S. authorities alone is enough in order to transform a sovereign state into a criminal enterprise, any act of force against which can now be called a law enforcement operation and the defense of national interests. We see no point in delving on the absurd nature of the U.S. pseudo-legal methods, given how how significantly they fly in the face of international law and are inconsistent, especially given that in Washington themselves have sincerely recognized this. The statement of the U.S. President on the 16th of December does not need any additional interpretation. This is a direct claim on the natural wealth and the soil of another state, and an open, if not to state, flagrant bringing to bear of military, political, and economic pressure with the aim of changing an inconvenient regime. The United States is already shoring up their practices with attacks of open piracy with the aim of seizing sovereign natural resources, which we all saw compellingly taking place in recent weeks. We firmly condemn the seizure by U.S. troops of petroleum tankers and the effective imposition of a blockade on Venezuela. The acts by the U.S. side run counter to all key norms of international law, including the UN Convention on Law of the Sea, Security Council resolutions, and the Charter itself of the United Nations. Colleagues, the illegal U.S. blockade on the coast of Venezuela is the most clear and absolutely real act of aggression. And the responsibility of Washington is also evident for the catastrophic consequences of such cowboy-like conduct for the residents of the country, which is now located. Unfortunately, we have every reason to believe that these are not one-off acts by the U.S. vis-a-vis Venezuela. This intervention, which is unfolding, can become a template for future acts of force against Latin American states in accordance with the so-called Trump corollary and the Monroe Doctrine, which was enshrined in the recently published U.S. national security policy. And this is a clear message for all countries in the region who are striving to conduct a sovereign policy and to independently determine their own economic, political, and cultural system. In Washington, they are ready to respect your independence and take your interests into account only if you are willing to tailor them to the interests of the United States and to conduct a policy which is convenient to and beneficial to them. As soon as you attempted to try to benefit your own people, then then you would be treated the same way that Venezuela is being treated. So don't ask for whom the bell tolls. The bell tolls for you. We reaffirm our solidarity with the Venezuelan people as they face the trials before them. We support the policy of the government of Mr. Maduro, which is geared towards the protection of the national interest and sovereignty of the homeland. We believe that all of those for whom international law is not mere noise have an obligation to stand with Venezuela. We note that Caracas has consistently demonstrated a willingness to engage in dialogue, to cooperate with Washington, both in terms of effectively coordinating acts for countering narcotics trafficking, as well as to combat real, not imagined terrorism. By all accounts, support for peaceful means of settling dispute and multilateral cooperation in these areas are something which are being advocated by all countries in the region, and yet for some reason for Washington, this is falling on deaf ears, and they are obstinately embracing their policy of destruction, which is fraught with grave consequences for the region and the world as a whole. We regret the fact that the new U.S. administration, which has been sober and pragmatic in its approach when it comes to other crisis situations, when it comes to Venezuela, it remains mired in approaches which itself actively criticizes. We trust that common sense will indeed prevail and that Washington will manage in time to halt, to prevent a fatal error which inevitably will undermine long-term U.S. national interests. The full-fledged armed conflict in Latin America, which remains for now a zone of peace, is the last thing that humankind needs right now. Humankind to whom President Trump promised an end to conflict. For now, unfortunately, the situation is not improving, and the United States, alas, continues to sow chaos in the Western Hemisphere, largely annihilating the benefits of the initiatives undertaken by the new U.S. leader and casting doubt on his sincere intentions in the global context. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of China.
President, China appreciates Slovenia presidency for convening this emergency meeting requested by Venezuela and supported by Russia, China, and other countries. We thank ASD Kiari for his briefing. For some time now, under the pretext of combating drug trafficking, the United States have continued to increase its military deployment in the waters of the Caribbean off the coast of Venezuela. It has escalated sanctions, blockades, and military threats against Venezuela, and claimed to have sunk Venezuelan vessels, shot dead crew members, and seized oil tankers. It has designated the Venezuelan government as a foreign terrorist organization, claimed that Venezuela's territory, oil, and assets belong to the United States, and even threatened military strikes against the Venezuelan territory. The U.S. actions and rhetoric have led to continued tensions in the region, raising serious concerns among regional countries and the international community. The UN Charter establishes fundamental principles governing international relations, including sovereign equality, non-interference in internal affairs, and peaceful settlement of disputes. They constitute the cornerstone of international rule of law and are crucial for maintaining world peace and security. The U.S. actions seriously infringe upon other countries' sovereignty, security, and legitimate rights and interests, gravely violate the UN Charter and international law, and threaten peace and security in Latin America and the Caribbean. More and more countries in the region and beyond have voiced a grave concern about and a strong condemnation of the U.S. actions. We note that Secretary General Guterres has clearly stated the need for all countries to respect international law and the UN Charter, exercise restraint, and de-escalate tensions to preserve regional stability, and his readiness to play a mediation role to this end. China attaches importance to President Maduro's recent open letter. As an independent sovereign state, Venezuela has the right to independently develop mutually beneficial cooperation with other countries and defend its legitimate rights and interests, which should be respected and supported by the international community. China opposes all acts of unilateralism and bullying and supports all countries in defending their sovereignty and national dignity. We stand against any move that violates the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and infringes upon other countries' sovereignty and security, against the threat or use of force in international relations, against external interference in Venezuela's internal affairs under any pretext, and against illicit unilateral sanctions and long-arm jurisdiction that have no basis in international law or authorization by the Security Council. We call on the United States to heed the just call of the international community, immediately halt relevant actions, and avoid further escalation of tensions. We urge the United States to uphold the navigation safety of regional countries and the freedom and rights they enjoy under international law, to conduct normal law enforcement and judicial cooperation under bilateral and multilateral legal frameworks, to lift illicit unilateral sanctions, and to do more to promote peace, stability, and development in Latin America and the Caribbean. President, Latin America and the Caribbean constitute an important part of the Global South and are a vital force in maintaining world peace and stability and promoting global development and prosperity. China recently released its third policy paper on Latin America and the Caribbean, in which it reaffirms its support for the proclamation of Latin America and the Caribbean as a zone of peace and the declaration of member states of the Agency for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in Latin America and the Caribbean. This fully demonstrates the high importance attached to and support for the region. China stands ready to work with countries in the region to strengthen solidarity and cooperation, uphold fairness and justice, and jointly safeguard peace and stability in Latin America and the Caribbean. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me begin by stating and reiterating the United States does not recognize Nicolas Maduro or his cronies as the legitimate government of Venezuela. Nicolas Maduro is a fugitive from American justice and the head of the foreign terrorist organization Cartel de los Soles. In fact, Maduro and his regime stole the election, and the international community has the receipts. President Trump has been very clear that he is going to use the full power of the United States of America, the full might of the United States, to take on and eradicate these drug cartels which have operated with impunity in our hemisphere for far too long, and everyone knows it. The single most serious threat to this hemisphere, our very own neighborhood, and the United States, is from transnational terrorist and criminal groups. These cartels are not like the mafia. These cartels are sophisticated, very technically capable, well-financed, and are wreaking havoc in our region. In its own 2025 World Drug Report, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime identified Venezuela as the key trafficking route in the entire Western Hemisphere for illegal drugs and for illegal narcotics and materials entering the United States and increasingly Europe. The United States will impose and enforce sanctions to the maximum extent to deprive Maduro of the resources he uses to fund Cartel de los Soles, which the United States has designated as a foreign terrorist organization along with Tren de Aragua. Important to this council meeting today, this includes profits from the sale of oil used to finance these cartels. The reality of the situation is that sanctioned oil tankers operate as the primary economic lifeline for Maduro and his illegitimate regime. The sanctioned tankers also fund the narco-terrorist group Cartel de los Soles. Maduro is responsible for trafficking, using these resources and using these profits into both the United States and Europe. And one has to ask, why have sanctions, either bilaterally, unilaterally, or backed by the international community, if they're not enforced? Well, the United States under President Trump is enforcing them in international waters. Otherwise, they are just empty words. Further, not only does Maduro's illegitimate regime openly cooperate and fund terrorist and criminal organizations, but it invites terrorist groups like Hezbollah, like the Iranian regime, militias like the ELN and FARC dissidents to operate openly within their territory, unimpeded and unencumbered. Maduro's ability to sell Venezuela's oil enables his fraudulent claim to power and his narco-terrorist activities. The people of Venezuela, frankly, deserve better. These people who have suffered under Maduro's socialist dictatorship. It is the action and policies of the illegitimate Maduro regime that pose an extraordinary threat to our hemisphere's peace and stability, and to that of the United States. The bottom line is whether it is physical attacks on our buildings and infrastructure, like we suffered on 9/11, or hybrid attacks, like flooding our country with criminals and deadly chemicals. The United States will do everything in our considerable power to protect our hemisphere, our borders, and the American people. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Gracias.
Thank you, Mr. President. We're grateful to the President for convening this meeting, and we're also grateful to Assistant Secretary General for the Middle East, Asia, and Pacific, Mohammed Khaled Kiari, for his detailed report on the situation that brings us together today. We acknowledge the attendance of the delegations of the countries of the region who honor us with their presence. The peoples of Panama and Venezuela have maintained a deep and long-lasting historical relationship marked by the ideals of liberty and regional integration promoted by Simón Bolívar, and through concrete diplomacy and mediation efforts, starting from the Amphitrionic Congress of Panama that next year will mark its bicentennial, up to the joint mediation role played in the framework of the Contadora Group. It is precisely pursuant to this close history, shared history, that Panama cannot remain indifferent in the face of the profound political, economic, and humanitarian crisis, as well as the violations of human rights that currently are occurring in this brethren republic as a result of the decisions and practices of a regime whose actions have gravely eroded the democracy of its people. For Panama, there is no question that the opposition candidate, Mr. Edmundo González Urrutia, was the elected winner in the last elections. The records that confirm his victory and confirm the popular will expressed in the polls by the Venezuelan people remain and will continue to remain in the hands of Panama. Mr. President, our region is confronting very complex challenges in the area of security that are global in character, including transnational organized crime and drug trafficking. In this context, even though our region is not the main source of demand for narcotics, it has had to bear for decades the disproportionate cost due to the dynamics of production and distribution, reflected in the thousands of human lives lost as a consequence of violence associated with this severe scourge. In this context, Panama urges the states of the hemisphere to coordinate and strengthen cooperation efforts to step up the fight against transnational organized crime, including trafficking of drugs, by using the relevant international instruments such as the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, UNTOC. At the same time, while sharing the legitimate concerns pertaining to drug trafficking and categorically rejecting any authoritarian regime, we would like to appeal for the respect of the UN Charter, and in particular its Article 2 that pertains to the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states, as well as the international legal human rights framework, including the right to life, freedom, and personal security. In this context, Panama notes with concern the recent security incidents recorded in the Caribbean Sea and the Pacific Ocean. These highlight the need to act strictly in adherence to international law and the UN Charter in order to avoid any escalation that could affect regional stability. As a transit country and with a maritime vocation, Panama will continue to advocate for any action that could affect the freedom of navigation, neutrality, stability, and peace in the oceans, that it be strictly in line with international law, including the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, of which we are a party. The neutrality of the canal, enshrined in the international treaty signed between Panama and the United States in 1977, to which over 40 states have become parties, represents a fundamental guarantee for the free transit and stability. In this context, Panama reaffirms its commitment to preserve the aforementioned neutrality as a pillar of peace and regional and global stability, while it urges the states who have not yet signed on to this instrument to join it, thus contributing to international maritime peace, stability, and cooperation. Panama would like to make an appeal for dialogue and a peaceful and sustainable solution in Venezuela. And we believe that it is timely for the United Nations, especially the Secretary General, to use his mechanisms of preventive diplomacy to contribute to the de-escalation of tensions. Panama reiterates its clear and unshakable position in defense of the United Nations Charter and multilateralism as indispensable instruments to preserve regional peace and stability. In this framework, we would like to recall that Latin America and the Caribbean was declared a zone of peace 11 years ago and will continue to promote this condition so that the region preserves it, advocating constantly for respect for international law and human rights for the benefit and well-being of our peoples. Thank you.
Representative of Panama for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. We thank ASG Kiari for his briefing, and we welcome the participation of many countries from the region. We have long been clear that Nicolas Maduro's regime claim to power lacks legitimacy. Venezuela's National Electoral Council has still failed to publish the full results of the July 2024 presidential elections after 18 months. Independent domestic and international reports observed significant irregularities and a lack of transparency. Meanwhile, political freedoms in Venezuela remain severely restricted. The human rights situation continues to deteriorate. Its political and judicial systems continue to erode. We remain deeply concerned about ongoing repression in Venezuela and the everyday struggles of Venezuelans. This includes extreme levels of poverty and failing basic services, which are precipitating a displacement crisis affecting the whole region. The United Kingdom stands firmly with the people of Venezuela in their pursuit of a democratic future. The voices of all Venezuelans need to be heard. They deserve a government which reflects their will at the ballot box. We will continue to work to achieve a peaceful, negotiated transition in Venezuela which ensures that the will of all Venezuelans is respected. As we said in October, drug trafficking and organized crime continue to endanger communities across the globe, undermining stability and putting our shared security at risk. We will continue to work with partners in Latin America and elsewhere to tackle this issue and address challenges. President, the United Kingdom reaffirms its unwavering commitment to the principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter. We believe these foundations are essential for maintaining global peace, security, and the rule of law. The UN Convention on the Law of the Sea is a cornerstone of international law on ocean-related issues. The United Kingdom will always support international law and the upholding of it. We continue to monitor this situation closely. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I also thank ASG Khaled Kiari for his important briefing. Sierra Leone takes note of the relevant letters by the permanent representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela and the concerns placed before the Council regarding developments in the Caribbean Sea. Throughout our current tenure on this Council, Sierra Leone has sought to support peacemaking, dialogue, and a steady commitment to international law. We do so mindful that, as we've commemorated the 80th anniversary of the United Nations and the signing of its charter, a deliberate choice was made in 1945 to opt for collective security instead of balance of power or hegemonic security. The latter doctrines failed to stop the two world wars. 80 years on, this collective security scheme, premised on international law, is under tremendous strain. The system can only remain as strong and effective as we share adherence to its principles, especially the sovereign equality of states, the peaceful settlement of dispute, and the prohibition on the threat or use of force. As we approach the end of our United Nations Security Council tenure, we've sought to defend the very principles all 103 member states have agreed to uphold. In that spirit, my delegation would offer the following observations. First, Sierra Leone recalls the importance attached by states of Latin America and the Caribbean to maintaining the Caribbean as a zone of peace. This approach reflects a preference for restraint and for resolving differences through dialogue. We recall the position of CARICOM heads of state and government, who reaffirm maintaining the Caribbean as a zone of peace and emphasize dialogue and engagement towards the peaceful settlement of dispute. We therefore encourage all concerned to keep this regional aspiration in view and to avoid steps that will heighten tensions or create misunderstanding or miscalculations. Second, Sierra Leone recalls and reaffirms the principle of permanent sovereignty of state over their natural resources. This is a well-established principle of international law that supports sovereign equality and development. It also reinforces that any disagreement relating to resources, economic measures, or associated activities should be addressed through the lawful and peaceful means, including appropriate dialogue and cooperation, as well as other methods of peaceful settlement of dispute rather than through coercion or force. Third, and most importantly, Sierra Leone underscores that the United Nations Charter provides the guiding legal framework for current interstate relations. Article 2, paragraph 4 obliges all states to refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. The Charter permits the use of force only in limited and clearly defined circumstances, such as when authorized by this Council under Chapter 7, or in the exercise of the inherent right of self-defense in response to an armed attack, consistent with Article 51. These rules are central to international stability and are intended to prevent escalation, miscalculation, and illegal wars of choice. Mr. President, these principles are particularly relevant in the maritime domain. Sierra Leone recalls that the high seas are governed by international law, including the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, which codifies relevant customary international law applicable to parties concerned and provides a framework for navigation, maritime safety, and the peaceful use of the oceans. For many states, especially developing and small states, predictable maritime rules are essential to trade, development, and regional stability. Against this backdrop, Sierra Leone notes the report of incidents at sea involving the use of force and loss of life. Without prejudging the facts, we emphasize a general point of law. When states respond to transnational challenges, whether illicit trafficking, organized crime, or terrorism, those responses must remain consistent with the Charter and other applicable rules of international law, including relevant maritime rules and international human rights law. In that regard, Sierra Leone also recalls that outside a situation of armed conflict, the use of lethal force is subject to strict constraint under international human rights law, including the protection of the right to life. As a general principle, operations of a law enforcement character should seek, wherever feasible, to intercept and bring suspects to justice through due process. Reports that suggest loss of life in circumstances that may not meet the strict requirement of necessity and proportionality understandably raises serious legal questions and underscore the importance of credible clarifications. Sierra Leone further notes the value of legal clarity and consistency in public explanations for any use of force. Clarity about the legal basis for action, whether under the Charter, the Law of the Sea, or other applicable rules, can help reduce misunderstanding, miscalculation, avoid escalation, and strengthen confidence in the international law-based system. Mr. President, having expressed our observations, Sierra Leone's primary appeal today is for calm, restraint, and diplomacy. We encourage all parties concerned to avoid rhetoric or actions that could aggravate tensions and to pursue appropriate channels for dialogue, engagement, and peaceful settlement consistent with the UN Charter. We therefore welcome the statement by the Secretary General and his offer to use his good office's role in this regard. The Council's role is also to uphold the integrity of the international law framework. Where tensions arise, the consistent reaffirmation of the Charter principles can help create space for de-escalation and constructive engagement. In that respect, Sierra Leone reiterates that the consistent application of international law is essential to maintaining trust in multilateralism and to safeguarding the collective security scheme. In closing, we wish to reiterate that through restraint, dialogue, and fidelity to the law, peace is best protected. Yet it may be more effective to conclude with a simple message. Let peace reign, and blessed are the peacemakers. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank ASG Khaled Kiari for his briefing. I also welcome the participation of the permanent representative of Venezuela in this meeting, along with representatives of many other countries of the region. We remain deeply concerned by the disturbing news emerging from the Caribbean region and the escalating tensions. We take note of Venezuela's letters addressed to the President of the Security Council and that of yesterday, 22nd December, sharing its perspective on these developments and highlighting the potential risks to regional peace, security, and stability that require the attention of the Council. In a world marred by polarization, with conflicts affecting the lives and livelihoods of millions around the globe, it is all but imperative to once again underscore the centrality and inviolability of the UN Charter and its core principles, including friendly relations among nations based on respect for the principles of equal rights and self-determination of peoples, sovereign equality of all member states, peaceful settlement of disputes, prohibition on the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, and non-interference in the internal affairs of other states. Any unilateral measures that run contrary to these cardinal principles and the tenets of international law risk setting dangerous precedents with far-reaching consequences. Mr. President, we firmly believe that the current trajectory serves no one's interests. The path of confrontation and zero-sum approaches do not bode well for peace and tranquility in the region. Any action that negatively impacts vital economic lifelines, exacerbates humanitarian challenges, and closes the doors to dialogue must be avoided. We firmly believe that the principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of states, as enshrined in the UN Charter, are sacrosanct. We also reiterate our support for the principles reaffirmed by UN General Assembly Resolutions 1803 and 3171 on permanent sovereignty over natural resources, endorsing the inalienable right of peoples and nations to freely dispose of their wealth, including natural resources. My delegation reiterates once again our consistent and principled position that any measures undertaken to counter transnational organized crime or cross-border narcotics drug trafficking must be undertaken in a cooperative manner and should remain in full conformity with international law. Mr. President, allow me to conclude by calling upon all sides to exercise maximum restraint, to de-escalate tensions, and to refrain from any actions that could further aggravate the situation. We urge all sides to engage in diplomacy for peacefully resolving their differences, respecting the imperative of peaceful coexistence, and choosing the path of dialogue and cooperation to ensure that the Latin American and Caribbean region is indeed a zone of peace. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Mr. President, we thank you for convening this meeting in response to the letter from the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. We also extend our appreciation to ASG Khaled Kiari for his comprehensive briefing on the war in development. We welcome the representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, as well as the representatives from the region to this meeting. Our delegation is following the developments in the Caribbean region with close attention and concern. The issues raised today highlight the risks that heightened tensions can pose the regional and international peace and stability. In this context, we wish to emphasize the importance of restraint, calm, and dialogue among all concerned parties. It's essential that every effort be made to avoid actions or rhetoric that could further escalate the situation. We encourage all parties to use diplomatic channels and established international mechanisms to address all concerns. We reiterate that upholding the principles of the United Nations Charter, particularly the peaceful resolution of disputes, remains fundamental to preserving stability in the region and beyond. At this delicate juncture, we urge all stakeholders to act with caution and responsibility. We affirm our readiness to support any efforts aimed at the escalation and mutual understanding. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Somalia for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank ASG Kiari for his briefing, and I also welcome the participation of many countries of the region in the meeting. Greece continues to follow developments in the Caribbean region closely and is concerned by the further escalation of tensions. We join the Secretary General in advocating for de-escalation, the exercise of maximum restraint and respect for international law, particularly the United Nations Charter. I would like to make 3 points, Mr. President. First, we call for the peaceful resolution of any disputes through dialogue and diplomacy. In any case, adherence to international humanitarian law and the protection of civilians remains vital. Second, we caution against an escalation that would also pose a threat to maritime security in the Caribbean and could have repercussions for the wider regional stability. In this context, upholding the law of the sea, specifically the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, remains of paramount importance. Third, we fully support the region's effort to combat drug trafficking and fight organized crime, which may constitute serious threats to regional and international security. Those activities should ideally be pursued through law enforcement and judicial cooperation channels with a view to disrupting criminal organizations and dismantling their business models. In conclusion, Mr. President, Greece stands ready to support all bilateral, regional and international efforts for a de-escalation in the region through dialogue and diplomacy in line with international law and international humanitarian law. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank ASG Kiari for his comprehensive briefing and welcome the participation of the permanent representative of Venezuela and representatives of other member states from our region in today's meeting. Colleagues, this Council is tasked with the solemn responsibility of the maintenance of international peace and security in accordance with the United Nations Charter. It is not an exaggeration to say that peace and security in our region are gravely threatened, meriting the Council's urgent attention. Guyana is among those states most affected by these threats. In defiance of international law, including the express orders of the International Court of Justice, Venezuela has, by presidential decree and legislative enactment, purported to unlawfully annex more than 2/3 of Guyana's sovereign territory. It has built up its military forces adjacent to our territory to threaten us with outright seizure of it. Disregarding the universally recognized international boundary between our two states, it has allowed and facilitates the transport of illicit drugs into Guyana while illegally mining Guyanese gold and smuggling it out of our country. Mr. President, the trafficking of illicit drugs in particular has for too long been a scourge on our region, driving crime and violence and undermining the rule of law by weakening state institutions, fueling corruption, financing conflict and terrorism, and threatening national and regional security. There has been a consistent but thus far unsuccessful effort by leaders in our region to disrupt the criminal networks, some of them state sanctions, that fuel this cycle of destruction. Meanwhile, the threat to our security has grown more urgent and more acute. We cannot put off any longer the decisive action that is required to address it. But none of us can hope to accomplish this acting alone. As such, we once again stress, as we did on 10th October, that supporting and strengthening collaboration with our international partners, especially those in South, Central, and North America and the Caribbean, is both essential and urgent. We must act collectively in a manner that preserves the stability of our region, long recognized as a zone of peace and which enhances the safety and security of our peoples. The ambition to pursue healthy, safe, and prosperous lives for all our peoples can only be realized in an environment of sustained peace and stability. This requires cooperation and collective action among all states committed to these ends. Guyana is fully committed to such partnerships and pledges its utmost support. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank A.S. Kiari for his comprehensive briefing. The Republic of Korea is closely monitoring the recent development related to Venezuela and is attentive to the security concerns raised by the relevant parties. The need to address transnational organized crime, including drug trafficking, is an issue the international community cannot ignore. At the same time, respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, as well as protection of civilians remain core values that the United Nations Charter seeks to uphold. In this regard, the Republic of Korea recognized the importance of efforts to counter international crime and the effective implementation of sanctions. Moreover, we believe it is equally important that such measures are carefully managed so they do not escalate into military tensions that could undermine peace and stability in the region. We firmly believe that transnational issues of this nature can best be addressed by taking cooperative approach by regional parties. The Republic of Korea appreciates that Latin America and the Caribbean has long demonstrated a strong commitment to multilateralism and peace, as reflected in the Treaty of Tlatelolco and the region's declaration as a zone of peace. In this spirit, we encourage strengthened regional cooperation and coordinated action to counter transnational organized crime in close partnership with relevant international and multilateral mechanisms. Mr. President, the Republic of Korea believes that upholding an international order and the collective security system grounded in the UN Charter is a responsibility we all share. To this end, the Republic of Korea remains committed to contributing constructively to ensuring that this matter is addressed with due caution and in a responsible manner in accordance with the principles of the UN Charter and international law. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I would like to thank you for convening this meeting at such a critical moment. I also wish to thank ASG Khaled Kiari for his detailed and informative briefing. And I would further like to welcome the participation to this meeting of the representatives of Venezuela, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Cuba, Mexico, Nicaragua, and Paraguay. President, Algeria is following recent developments in the Caribbean region with close attention and with deep concern, particularly reports regarding actions directed at Venezuelan oil tankers. These developments raise serious questions and risk further heightening tensions in an already delicate regional context. In this regard, Algeria underscores the imperative of avoiding any steps that could lead to escalation or confrontation, as such outcomes would have serious consequences for regional and international peace and security. The Charter of the United Nations enshrines the fundamental principles that rules peaceful relations among states. These include respect for sovereign equality, self-determination of peoples, territorial integrity, non-interference in internal affairs, and the peaceful settlement of dispute. It is paramount in this regard to recall Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter, which states, and I quote, all members shall refrain in their international relations for the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, or in any other manner and consistent with the purposes of the United Nations. These principles are not merely aspirational. They constitute binding obligations under international law and frame our collective responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. We call upon all the concerned actors to exercise restraint and to refrain from any actions or rhetoric that could further inflame tensions or deepen divisions. Dialogue and diplomacy remain the most effective and indeed the only means of resolving disagreement and preserving peace and stability in the region. Against the backdrop of this development, Algeria recalls the significance of maintaining Latin America and the Caribbean as a zone of peace, as proclaimed by the states of the region 11 years ago. This shared commitment should continue to guide conduct and relations among all parties. In this context, Algeria encourages regional organizations, including CARICOM and the Organization of American States, to play a constructive role in fostering an environment conducive to dialogue, supporting impartial mediation efforts, and avoiding actions that could aggravate tensions or further polarize the situation in Venezuela. President, the fight against drug trafficking and transnational organized crime constitutes a common challenge, particularly in Latin America and the Caribbean. Addressing this threat requires shared responsibility, as no state can confront it effectively in isolation. Effective response to these challenges must be grounded in international cooperation, in mutual respect, and in solidarity, rather than confrontation, polarization, or unilateral measures. In this regard, Algeria stresses that despite how legitimate are the efforts to combat drug trafficking and transnational organized crime, they must never derail from this objective. This is a global challenge that should foster unity and cooperation, not division among nations. In conclusion, President, Algeria calls on all parties to adhere strictly to the principles and purposes of the Charter of the United Nations. History has repeatedly demonstrated that war and military intervention do not lead to lasting peace. On the contrary, they undermine it, as they always produce ripple effects that extend beyond borders, affecting neighboring countries and entire regions. The only viable path forward to solve this issue lies in diplomacy, in cooperation, and in full respect of international law. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. President. And let me also thank Assistant Secretary General Kiari for his briefing and welcome the many representatives from the region to this meeting. Denmark joins the Secretary General in expressing concern about the heightened tensions in the Caribbean Sea. Tensions that have continued to increase since this Council last met to discuss the topic in October. We have taken note of the letters sent to the Security Council by the permanent representative of Venezuela over the past several weeks, expressing concern about continued escalations and military buildup. Denmark also takes note of the official statements from the United States government on their operations to combat drug traffickers and stem the illicit flow of illegal narcotics. Mr. President, drug trafficking remains a persistent threat to the safety, health, and well-being of millions around the world. Denmark recognizes the devastating impact of this organized crime and underscores that all counter-narcotic efforts must be done in accordance with international law, including the fundamental principles and rules in the UN Charter. This also includes treaties such as the UN Convention Against Illicit Traffic in Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances and the UN Convention on Law of the Seas. We further stress multilateral initiatives and enhanced international cooperation to combat drug trafficking, to target sources of financing, and to bolster border control. Regional mechanisms and cooperation remain important in the fight against transnational organized crime. Mr. President, Denmark underscores the importance of preserving the Caribbean as a zone of peace, as proclaimed by leaders of the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States. Denmark strongly urges all parties to strictly adhere to international law and to de-escalate tensions and exercise the necessary restraint. Maritime security in the Caribbean Sea must be preserved. Differences must be resolved through peaceful means, diplomacy, and political solutions. We further urge greater engagement with the United Nations and regional bodies such as the CARICOM and the OAS to play a role in facilitating dialogue and de-escalation. Mr. President, before I conclude, I want to express Denmark's solidarity with the people of Venezuela and their inherent right to democracy, freedom, and inalienable human rights. We do not believe the democratic will of the people of Venezuela was respected during the election in 2024, which were not transparent and also failed to meet the international standards of electoral integrity. We further remain deeply troubled by the Maduro's regime's continued repression and its sustained assault on the fundamental human rights of the Venezuelan people, particularly through its targeting of opposition voices, independent media, and human rights defenders. We recall that a UN fact-finding mission earlier this week reported that Venezuela's Bolivarian National Guard has committed serious human rights violations and crimes against humanity in Venezuela for more than a decade with full impunity. In this context, we regret the recent decision of the National Parliament of Venezuela to initiate the country's withdrawal from the International Criminal Court. Denmark calls on the Venezuelan Authority to restore democratic institutions, political stability, and human rights for the Venezuelan people. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Denmark for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, I wish first and foremost to thank the Assistant Secretary General, Mr. Kiari, for his statement. France has been closely monitoring the developments transpiring in the region, specifically in the wake of President Donald Trump's announcements related to Venezuelan airspace and the naval blockade against oil tankers under sanction, which are entering and exiting Venezuela. We call for avoidance of all escalation that may threaten peace and security in the region and beyond. As always, we recall our commitment to respect for international law, and in particular, the Charter of the United Nations. The principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity of states must be upheld. International disputes must always be resolved peacefully in accordance with Article 2, Paragraph 3 of the Charter. We support the Secretary General's call for restraint and immediate de-escalation, as well as his offer of good offices. We extend our support as well for the mediation proposals emanating from states in the region who may contribute. President, combating narcotics trafficking needs to be done in accordance with international law, in particular the Charter of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and various international conventions on drug control, specifically the United Nations Convention against illicit trafficking in narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances dating 1988, which sets out the relevant framework of action against illicit trafficking at sea, vis-a-vis the respect for the Montego Bay Convention and in respect for international law and human rights. We reiterate our commitment to combating narcotics trafficking, which represents a growing threat to safety, health of our citizens and the stability of our societies. To that end, we have beefed up our judicial and police-related means as these bodies are working to enhance cooperation among states of origin, transit, and springboard states. This cooperation is bearing fruit, as has been reflected recently with our contribution to the disbanding by the Panamanian authorities of a significant drug trafficking network with the destination of various European countries, including France, at the international airport, Panama Tocumen Airport. France reiterates our support for multilateral initiatives to dry up financing sources for trafficking networks and to beef up border control, specifically through mobilization for the establishment of a dedicated European sanctions regime for organized crime. To conclude, we wish to recall our solidarity with the Venezuelan people as they grapple with the political crisis. A dialogue in bringing in all stakeholders is necessary to restore stability in the country. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for the statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Slovenia. I want to thank Assistant Secretary General Kiari for his briefing. Colleagues, Slovenia remains gravely concerned about the current tensions in the Caribbean region, which have intensified since the Council last discussed the situation. Steps involving an increased military presence carry a serious risk of an unintentional escalation and must be avoided to ensure that the Southern Caribbean does not become a theater of confrontation. We reaffirm our position on the obligation of all member states, large and small, to respect international law, particularly the Charter of the United Nations. Principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence form the cornerstone of the collective security framework and must be respected, not only when one feels threatened. We note that international law also serves as the anchor in addressing maritime security challenges, including efforts to suppress illicit traffic in narcotic drugs, as well as ensuring the safety of maritime navigation. Colleagues, Slovenia is deeply troubled by the potential wider repercussions of these tensions for a region already facing unprecedented migration pressures. At this critical moment, it is imperative that member states exercise restraint and work to de-escalate the situation in order to preserve regional stability. Measures typically reserved for wartime, undermine Latin America and the Caribbean as a zone of peace and should be avoided to the fullest extent possible. On the other hand, we remain deeply alarmed by the persistent humanitarian and human rights challenges confronting the Venezuelan people, as reported by High Commissioner for Human Rights, as well as today by Assistant Secretary General Kiari. Against a backdrop of worsening economic and social hardship, restrictions on political and civic space continue to intensify. We are equally concerned by reports of the detention of dozens of foreign citizens who have been denied communication and access to their diplomatic and consular representatives, a clear breach of fundamental obligations under international law, in particular those enshrined in the Vienna Conventions. We call on Venezuelan authorities to fully uphold these obligations and, based on the rule of law, create the conditions necessary for a credible, inclusive, and meaningful political dialogue that respects the will of Venezuelan people. To conclude, as in any other conflict, there is no military solution to disagreements between the United States and Venezuela and the tensions in the Caribbean. We welcome and encourage initiatives by regional leaders aimed at pursuing peaceful avenues for de-escalation. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela.
Señor Presidente.
Mr. President, one of the countries sitting at this table has publicly stated that it wants to annex our country. On the 16th of December, its president demanded that we immediately hand over our land, our oil, and our minerals because they supposedly belong to them. He said that if we did not comply with his ultimatum, he would unleash the fury of the greatest navy in history on our country. Mr. President, we are in the presence of a power that acts outside of international law, demanding that Venezuelans vacate our country and hand over our Orinoco River, our Lake Maracaibo, our Margarita Island, our beaches, rivers, plains, and mountains. Otherwise, he will carry out an armed attack, which he has been announcing for weeks. This is the greatest extortion known in our history, a gigantic crime of aggression in progress, beyond all rational parameters, all legal logic, all historical precedent. But it's not just about Venezuela. The ambition is continental. The U.S. government has expressed this in its national security strategy, which states that the future of the continent belongs to them, with the enactment of the Monroe Doctrine in the 21st century now aggravated by the Trump corollary. Our liberator Simón Bolívar warned of this more than 200 years ago when he said, and I quote, that the United States seemed to be destined by Providence to plague Latin America with misery in the name of liberty. End of quote. We want to alert the world. Venezuela is only the first target of a larger plan. The U.S. government wants us to be divided so it can conquer us piece by piece. The United States, which was an indispensable country in the construction of the United Nations and in the drafting of its founding charter, has today become an actor that seeks to impose itself on the fundamental rights of all states in the Western Hemisphere, even at the cost of destroying the UN. We have requested this meeting, aware that the U.S. government will not allow this body to adopt a decision that would put a stop to its sinister plan. The world should know that last November, the U.S. government was the only one that prevented an agreement in the Security Council to condemn attacks against civilians on the high seas and to call for détente, dialogue, and diplomacy. The U.S. government is preventing the Security Council from fulfilling its mandate. If in 1945 that country was a force for good, today it has become a state that threatens international law and peace and security. The world must know that the threat is not Venezuela. The threat is the current U.S. government. Mr. President, the murders in the Caribbean Sea and the Pacific Ocean carried out by the U.S. government of the last few months are the first evidence of its plan to impose its power in the region in flagrant violation of international law and human rights. There have been more than 29 attacks resulting in more than 101 victims, non-combatant civilians, in the absence of armed conflict, who were coldly murdered, violating their right to the presumption of innocence and due process. Let it be clear once and for all that there is no war in the Caribbean. There is no international armed conflict, nor is there a non-international one, which is why it is absurd for the U.S. government to seek to justify its actions by applying the rules of war. The invocation of Article 51 of the United Nations Charter to explain terrorism against civilians, masked by the argument of self-defense, is a perverse distortion of the law, attempting to turn small unarmed boats in the Caribbean, thousands of kilometers from the United States, into alleged perpetrators of an armed attack with weapons of mass destruction. These are extrajudicial executions, willful killings committed by military force against unarmed civilians. We stated that before the Security Council on the 10th of October. Today, it is absolutely clear that the U.S. government is not only violating international law, but also its own domestic legislation. Today, when there are 4 times as many victims, they do not dare to show the recorded evidence of the killings because their cruelty would provoke worldwide revulsion. Despite this, today, with more than 100 victims, the killer who roams the Caribbean claims that there is no end in sight to their crimes against humanity. Mr. President, on 16th of December, President Donald Trump publicly stated the following, and I quote, "Today, I'm ordering a total and complete blockade of all sanctioned oil tankers going in and out of Venezuela," end of quote. This is a confession of a crime, specifically a crime of aggression, with which the President of the United States intends to turn back the clock of history 200 years to impose a colony on Venezuela. On 10th of December, meanwhile, U.S. military units violently assaulted a vessel engaged in lawful international trade in international waters in the Caribbean. They subdued and kidnapped the entire crew and illegally seized the cargo of Venezuelan oil, which was part of a legitimate and regular commercial operation. It was a robbery carried out by military force, which sets an extremely serious precedent for the safety of navigation and international trade. The illegal use of state force to carry out theft on the high seas is worse than piracy, since in this case it is not only a matter of stealing commercial vessels, which is evidence of intentionality and violating their rights to navigate in international waters, but also of the de facto annexation of the entire Caribbean Sea by a naval power. In doing so, in addition to violating Venezuela's inalienable right to trade legally with the world, it seeks to deny all countries the right to trade with Venezuela. Just 3 days ago, on 20th of December, a second act of the same nature took place, when another vessel carrying Venezuelan oil was similarly seized by the U.S. military forces in international waters in the Caribbean. The cargo was stolen, and the crew has been kidnapped. Immediately afterwards, Secretary of War Pete Hegseth indicated that such criminal operations would continue, while President Trump declared that he would keep the stolen cargo. So I'd like to ask, what right does the United States government has to appropriate to date almost 4 million barrels of Venezuelan oil? This alleged naval blockade is essentially a military act aimed at laying siege to the Venezuelan nation, degrading its economic and military apparatus, weakening its social and political cohesion, and causing internal chaos to facilitate aggression by external forces. That is, it's an armed attack. This has been stated by President Trump himself, who is also violating the right to existence of the entire Venezuelan people by deliberately denying them the essential means for their subsistence. Mr. President, on the 29th of November, President Trump stated, and I quote, "To all airlines, pilots, please consider the airspace over and around Venezuela as completely closed," end of quote. This statement was put into practice, among other things, by an electronic warfare campaign by U.S. military forces in the region, which has been blinding the navigation instruments of all civilian aircraft transiting Venezuelan airspace to provoke a security incident. Electronic interference in the Caribbean has nearly caused at least 2 tragedies involving U.S. civilian aircraft that were seconds away from colliding with aircraft belonging to their own country's air force. It should be noted that the civilian aircraft involved took off from Curaçao and Aruba, both bound for U.S. territory, proving that the danger created by that country's military forces against its own citizens also affects the airspace of other nations, such as the Netherlands Antilles. There can be no doubt the U.S. government poses a threat to the entire region, which has been declared a zone of peace since 2014. As we warned this body on the 9th of October, this type of behavior, combined with a series of unreported military incursions into Venezuela's flight information region, non-notified, unreported, is an attempt to provoke a direct confrontation. In other words, to fabricate a provocation that would allow Article 51 of the United Nations to be falsely invoked. The U.S. government, the aggressor, requires its propaganda apparatus to present it to the world as a country under attack, to initiate an armed conflict. We denounce this dangerous manipulation and assure the world that we will not lose our composure in defending the peace of our nation. Let us repeat, the threat is not Venezuela. The threat is the U.S. government. This set of proven facts cannot be viewed in isolation. They must be understood as a cumulative process of aggression that increases the destructive impact on the Venezuelan nation. They constitute illegal acts of direct use of armed force against a nation that is at perfect peace and has no conflict whatsoever with the United States. Unfortunately, the Security Council could miss an opportunity to stop the criminal plans of the U.S. government due to the abusive way in which the U.S. government exercises its power in this body. Today, the red line has been crossed, and the U.S. government bears international responsibility for the ongoing aggressions. Mr. President, we are facing a massive violation of the entire international legal architecture. It is a grotesque offense that violates every civilizational norm. Today, the U.S. government is imposing chaos and destruction on international relations, just as the evil actors who caused the Second World War did. The peremptory norms of international law, jus cogens, which are universally accepted and form a part of humanity's cultural heritage, are being ignored by the U.S. government, including the prohibition of aggression, the prohibition of crimes against humanity, and the right to self-determination. Article 2 of the Charter of the United Nations establishes guiding principles for international relations that the U.S. government is flagrantly violating. We refer to the principle of legal equality of states, as well as the principle of refraining from the use of, or the threat of the use of force against the territorial integrity and political independence of states. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights establishes that every individual has the right to liberty and security of a person. Similarly, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, to which the United States is a party, establishes life as an inherent right of every person, which no one may be arbitrarily deprived of. This central instrument also prohibits the deprivation of the means of subsistence of entire peoples. The Geneva Convention on the High Seas, to which the United States is also a party, establishes not only the right to freedom of navigation, but also that no state shall legitimately claim sovereignty over any part of the high seas, as these are open to all nations. The jurisprudence established by international courts confirms in turn that the principles of non-intervention in the internal affairs of states, refraining from the use or the threat of force, and respect for sovereignty are part of customary international law as reflected in judgments dating from 1986 to the present. General Assembly 1803 on the permanent sovereignty over natural resources establishes that the violation of such rights is contrary to the spirit and principles enshrined in the UN Charter. General Assembly Resolution 2625 establishes that a war of aggression constitutes a crime against peace, that it entails responsibility, and that another state shall not acquire the territory.
De adquisición por parte de otro Estado como resultado de la amenaza o el uso de la fuerza. La resolución 3314 de la Asamblea General señala que, independientemente de que haya o no declaración de guerra, el bloqueo de los puertos o de las costas de un Estado por las Fuerzas Armadas de otro Estado se constituye en un acto de agresión. A pesar de tener obligaciones jurídicamente vinculantes respecto a todos estos instrumentos, el gobierno de los Estados Unidos los viola abiertamente y con total impunidad. Sin embargo, el gobierno de los Estados Unidos, que se comporta como un actor irresponsable de la comunidad de naciones, pretende convencer al mundo de que la ley es para estricto cumplimiento de todos menos del gobierno de los Estados Unidos. Esa es la ideología del excepcionalismo, un Estado por encima de las leyes, un Estado sobre todo el mundo. Señor presidente, queda absolutamente claro que el problema no es Venezuela, el problema es el gobierno de los Estados Unidos. La transgresión masiva de la legalidad internacional debe ser entendida en sus raíces y por esta razón debemos desenmascarar las operaciones de desinformación que se han puesto en marcha por parte del gobierno de los Estados Unidos con un gigantesco aparato de propaganda para justificar su agresión contra un país pacífico como lo es Venezuela. Ya en el año 2019 se intentó imponer un gobernante títere para sustituir al gobierno legítimo de Venezuela y se llevaron a cabo operaciones clandestinas de sabotaje a los servicios esenciales. También se llevó a cabo un ataque desde el exterior disfrazado de ayuda humanitaria, varios intentos de magnicidio contra el presidente constitucional legítimo de la nación, una invasión fallida con terroristas y mercenarios, varios intentos de golpes de Estado, así como acciones para paralizar la producción petrolera, a las que se sumaron más de 1000 medidas coercitivas unilaterales. La nación venezolana resistió esta criminal operación de desestabilización, bajo el liderazgo del presidente Nicolás Maduro Moros, quien ha sido objeto de las campañas de propaganda internacional más intensas contra un jefe de Estado en la historia de nuestro continente. Hoy, en el 2025, ante el fracaso de todos los intentos anteriores, algunos grupos políticos en Estados Unidos necesitan una justificación para el uso directo de la Fuerza Armada. Las narrativas ensayadas por la maquinaria de propaganda han sido cambiantes, incoherentes, pero sobre todo falsas. Veamos las evidencias. La campaña de odio comenzó en los Estados Unidos con un ataque contra todas las venezolanas y todos los venezolanos, quienes fueron designados como enemigos extranjeros, invasores y terroristas, miembros del supuesto Tren de Aragua, y su presencia en Estados Unidos fue declarada como incompatible con la seguridad nacional de este país. Luego, se estigmatizó a todos nuestros connacionales como narcotraficantes y aún más se ha afirmado que en su gran mayoría son peligrosos delincuentes, escapados de cárceles y hospitales psiquiátricos. Se trata de una campaña xenofóbica y racista, como no se había visto una desde la Segunda Guerra Mundial contra otra nacionalidad de migrantes. Estamos en presencia de un clásico ejemplo de propaganda de guerra. No existe conexión alguna con la realidad, no existe evidencia, ni necesidad de presentarla, solo repetición de incoherencias con la esperanza de confundir, de crear una niebla que permita la agresión. Uno de los mayores creadores de la propaganda en el gobierno de los Estados Unidos durante la invasión a Irak lo dijo de un modo muy claro, cito, ahora somos un imperio y cuando actuamos creamos nuestra propia realidad. Y mientras ustedes estudian esa realidad, nosotros volveremos a actuar creando otras realidades que ustedes también podrán estudiar. Y así es como se resolverán las cosas. Somos los actores de la historia y ustedes, todos ustedes, solo podrán estudiar lo que hacemos. Fin de la cita. Señor presidente, las máscaras hoy se cayeron. Todas las excusas infotóxicas para envenenar a la opinión pública se enfrentan a la crudeza de los altos funcionarios del gobierno de los Estados Unidos, cuando anuncian que el objetivo real no es la droga, no es la seguridad, no es la libertad, es el petróleo, son las minas, es la tierra. El 16 de diciembre, el presidente de Estados Unidos expresó que, cito, Venezuela está completamente rodeada por la armada más grande jamás reunida en la historia de Sudamérica. Esta solo crecerá y la conmoción para ellos será como nunca antes la han visto, hasta que devuelvan a Estados Unidos todo el petróleo, las tierras y otros activos que nos robaron, todo lo cual debe ser devuelto inmediatamente. Fin de la cita. El 17 de diciembre, el subjefe de gabinete de la Casa Blanca, Stephen Miller, informó que toda la industria petrolera venezolana pertenece a Estados Unidos y exigió su devolución. El 20 de diciembre, el secretario de Guerra, Pete Hegseth, afirmó que el bloqueo contra Venezuela se mantendrá en plena vigencia hasta que nuestro país devuelva a los Estados Unidos los activos supuestamente robados. Todo esto significa que el gobierno estadounidense reclama como suyo la mayor reserva de petróleo del mundo, lo que sería uno de los mayores actos de expoliación en la historia de la humanidad. Esta absurda afirmación confirma que no hay límite alguno en la adicción del gobierno de los Estados Unidos por el petróleo y que todas las excusas esgrimidas en relación con nuestro país han sido parte de una cortina de humo. Es un plan de conquista y colonización que no tiene cabida en el siglo XXI. Un plan de extorsión que nos exige entregar a nuestro patrimonio y nuestro país a cambio de que las tropas estadounidenses no disparen contra nuestro pueblo. La afirmación descabellada, según la cual el petróleo venezolano pertenecería a los Estados Unidos bajo el argumento de una supuesta deuda histórica, no tiene sustento jurídico, político o histórico. Es simplemente inexistente. Ninguna creencia, y aún más una imaginaria, como en este caso, otorga a un Estado el derecho de recurrir al uso de la fuerza, ni mucho menos de apropiarse de manera unilateral de los recursos naturales de otro Estado. Aceptar tal lógica equivaldría a admitir que debido a la gigantesca deuda que los propios Estados Unidos mantienen con países como China, Japón o Reino Unido, pudiera justificar legalmente el ataque, bloqueo o total confiscación de activos y recursos estadounidenses, lo cual resulta evidentemente absurdo y contrario a cualquier orden jurídico. Conviene además recordar que en la relación energética entre Venezuela y Estados Unidos, ha sido Venezuela el país históricamente desfavorecido debido a esquemas comerciales y condiciones económicas injustas que beneficiaron durante décadas a la parte estadounidense. Venezuela se mantiene firme en la defensa de relaciones de cooperación energéticas basadas en la igualdad y beneficio mutuo, promovidas sobre la base de la igualdad soberana y el respeto para ambas partes. Se trata entonces de una de las proposiciones más deshonrosas y viles que hemos recibido en toda nuestra historia y la repudiamos desde lo más profundo de nuestro honor patriótico. La verdad es brutal y criminal. El gobierno de Estados Unidos amenaza con un ataque armado a Venezuela para satisfacer a las grandes corporaciones petroleras, particularmente a ConocoPhillips y ExxonMobil, pionera en el robo del petróleo venezolano. A los hijos de las familias estadounidenses se le ordenará arriesgar sus vidas para llenar los bolsillos de los accionistas de las empresas petroleras con miles de millones de dólares, mientras miles de familias venezolanas y estadounidenses son destruidas. Se trata de sangre por petróleo. Sangre por petróleo no es una propuesta noble, es indigna y es inaceptable. Guerra por petróleo es la propuesta de la muerte, la misma que le ofrecieron a Irak, a Siria, a Libia y a tantos otros. La conducta del gobierno estadounidense confirma la cínica frase de la propaganda de las guerras por petróleo que afirma, cito, es lamentable que Dios haya puesto el petróleo de los Estados Unidos en el territorio de otras naciones. Fin de la cita. Es la guerra de saqueo y pillaje con una bandera sacada del foso de los valores humanos. Debemos enfatizar que la propuesta del gobierno de los Estados Unidos, aunque fracase, constituye un atentado contra todo el sistema de relaciones internacionales y de manera especial contra el sur global, cuyos pueblos son considerados inferiores por el actual gobierno estadounidense. Este Consejo de Seguridad pierde sentido si el gobierno de los Estados Unidos persiste con su propuesta demoledora. Nadie está a salvo, nadie. No hay principios para regir nuestros países y nuestros pueblos. De allí la importancia de que este órgano pueda cumplir a cabalidad su mandato y a cuyos efectos exigimos condene explícitamente esta agresión en curso, desde las ejecuciones extrajudiciales hasta los actos de piratería. Exigimos también que adopte las medidas necesarias para que el gobierno de Estados Unidos repliegue sus fuerzas militares, ponga fin al uso de la fuerza y levante el bloqueo unilateral que ha impuesto contra nuestro país. Y por último, exigimos que se inicie un proceso de rendición de cuentas para sancionar estos hechos y prevenir su repetición. De lo contrario, se trata de la consolidación de un mundo oscuro, sin principios, sin ideales,
gobernado por la violencia y el deshonor. Es el mundo sin las Naciones Unidas. Repetimos, Venezuela no es la amenaza es el incumplimiento del derecho internacional. El mundo sabe que de continuar la escalada de ataques armados, nosotros ejerceremos con toda determinación nuestro derecho inalienable a la legítima defensa, con arreglo al artículo 51 de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas. Afortunadamente, el futuro puede ser diferente. Todos hemos visto cómo, a pesar de la propaganda guerrerista, la gran mayoría del pueblo de los Estados Unidos rechaza cualquier intento de guerra con Venezuela y exige el fin de la agresión en repudio a la destructiva ideología de las guerras sin fin. No existe tensión alguna entre los pueblos de los Estados Unidos y Venezuela. No existe. En Venezuela, nuestro pueblo está en paz, unido, lleno de fe patriótica, decidido a defender su tierra, su familia, su patrimonio, su historia y su honor. El Orinoco siempre será venezolano. No hay fuerza en la tierra que nos arrebate nuestro derecho a la existencia. Señor presidente, para finalizar, permítame ahora dirigir unas breves palabras a nuestro pueblo. Es un honor para nosotros representar aquí la voz de millones de venezolanas y venezolanos que están en nuestra patria trabajando serenamente por defender nuestro derecho a vivir en paz. Millones de mujeres y hombres que trabajan en los campos y ciudades, en las fábricas y en las escuelas, en los hospitales y en la Fuerza Armada Nacional Bolivariana, construyendo una nación digna, independiente y soberana. Todos debemos estar orgullosos de vivir este momento estelar de nuestra historia, este momento de ejercer la defensa de nuestra patria cuando una potencia extranjera llena de soberbia cree que puede convertirnos en colonia. Las venezolanas y venezolanos damos gracias a la vida por haber dado la oportunidad de luchar por nuestra segunda independencia y mostrarle al mundo de qué estamos hechos, de optimismo, de orgullo y de amor por la patria. Llegó el momento de unirnos en la defensa de lo que es nuestro. Hoy, cuando llenos de alegría nos preparamos para celebrar en familia la Navidad, recordemos también todos los esfuerzos de nuestros antepasados que nos entregaron la nación para cuidarla para nuestros hijos y para nuestras hijas. Hoy somos responsables de defender nuestro pasado, nuestro presente y nuestro futuro. Derrotemos el despotismo que levanta la voz. Gloria al bravo pueblo que el yugo lanzó. Hermanas y hermanas, juntos venceremos. Feliz Navidad para todas y todos. Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
I thank the representative of Venezuela for the statement. I would like to request the remaining 8 speakers to limit their statements to maximum 5 minutes if we are to finish the session within the allocated time. I give now the floor to the representative of Colombia.
Señor presidente, quisiéramos agradecer al subsecretario Kiari por su valioso reporte. Las recientes actividades militares efectuadas por los Estados Unidos en el mar, así como las declaraciones públicas realizadas al más alto nivel por el gobierno de Estados Unidos, están generando tensiones en una región que, hasta ahora, se ha caracterizado por la estabilidad y la convivencia pacífica. América Latina y el Caribe se ha proclamado como una zona de paz, sustentada en principios claros: la proscripción de la amenaza y el uso de la fuerza, la solución pacífica de controversias, la promoción del diálogo y el multilateralismo, el respeto irrestricto a la soberanía y la integridad territorial, la no injerencia en los asuntos internos de los estados y el derecho inalienable de los pueblos a la autodeterminación. La escalada de acciones de carácter militar no solo incrementa el riesgo de un conflicto de mayores proporciones, sino que, a la vez de ser contraria al derecho internacional, socava los esfuerzos colectivos de prevención de conflictos y la estabilidad regional. Colombia rechaza de manera categórica cualquier amenaza de uso a la fuerza y el recurrir a vías de hecho como medio para resolver diferencias. Estas acciones, así como las medidas coercitivas unilaterales que no se alinean con la Carta de las Naciones Unidas ni con las decisiones de ese organismo, socavan el Estado de Derecho y no pueden sustituir al diálogo, la diplomacia preventiva ni a los mecanismos pacíficos de solución de controversias, los cuales deben ser la prioridad en toda actuación entre los Estados. Señor Presidente, Colombia es plenamente consciente de que la delincuencia organizada transnacional, incluyendo el narcotráfico, constituye una amenaza significativa para alcanzar sociedades pacíficas e inclusivas. Sea esta la oportunidad para recalcar que Colombia ha demostrado un compromiso sostenido y verificable en la lucha contra el tráfico ilícito de estupefacientes y otras formas de delincuencia transnacional, como lo evidencian las cifras récord de incautaciones y operaciones conjuntas realizadas en estricto apego al derecho internacional, a la proporcionalidad y necesidad y al respeto por los derechos humanos. En ese sentido, hacemos un llamado a fortalecer la cooperación y coordinación regional e internacional de manera coherente con el principio de responsabilidad común y compartida y en el marco de los instrumentos legales y convenios internacionales vigentes. Lo anterior con el objetivo de construir un entorno seguro y estable en beneficio de nuestros pueblos y combatir así, en cumplimiento estricto de las obligaciones internacionales y la cooperación, todas las manifestaciones del delito transnacional. En ningún caso se debe permitir respuestas extrajudiciales ante actividades de la delincuencia organizada transnacional y o ataques contra la población civil y contra bienes de carácter civil. El silencio frente a hechos que amenazan la paz y la seguridad internacional no contribuye al escalamiento ni a la protección de los más vulnerables. Toda acción u omisión que no esté orientada a la paz no debe pasar impávida ante este Consejo, quien tiene la responsabilidad de alzar la voz y promover acciones coherentes con su mandato de mantener la paz y la seguridad internacionales. Colombia reitera su firme compromiso con la defensa de la paz, la estabilidad, la democracia y el desarrollo en toda la región, convencida de que solo a través del respeto mutuo, el apego estricto al derecho internacional, la cooperación multilateral y el diálogo se construyen soluciones duraderas. El combate a la delincuencia organizada transnacional debe realizarse exclusivamente bajo el respeto irrestricto de las normas internacionales vigentes, sin recurrir a acciones extrajudiciales ni a interpretaciones que pretendan justificar el uso de la fuerza más allá de los supuestos previstos en la Carta. Urgimos en este sentido a todas las partes a actuar con responsabilidad, contención y con la voluntad política de respetar la Carta de las Naciones Unidas y recurrir a la mediación y al diálogo, inclusive facilitado por la región, como único método válido para solucionar las diferencias. Agradezco, presidente.
I thank the representative of Colombia for the statement and I give the floor to the representative of Chile.
Gracias, señor presidente. Chile agradece a Eslovenia por la convocatoria de esta sesión informativa abierta bajo el punto del orden del día amenazas a la paz y la seguridad. Agradecemos asimismo la intervención del señor Khaled Kiari, subsecretario general para Oriente Medio, Asia y el Pacífico. Señor presidente, Chile desea expresar su profunda preocupación por el despliegue de operaciones militares a gran escala en el Caribe y rechazar cualquier acción armada que pueda poner en peligro la estabilidad y la paz en la región. Estas consideraciones recuerdan la importancia de respetar el derecho internacional, la soberanía y la integridad territorial, la solución pacífica de las controversias, la prohibición de la amenaza o el uso de la fuerza y el respeto de los derechos humanos. Chile desea subrayar además la necesidad urgente de continuar realizando esfuerzos coordinados para enfrentar la amenaza del crimen organizado transnacional, así como la convicción de que América Latina y el Caribe deben seguir siendo una zona de paz. Mi país ha sido consistente en su posición. Chile no reconoce la legitimidad del actual régimen encabezado por el señor Nicolás Maduro, debido a la ausencia de condiciones democráticas, garantías electorales y respeto pleno al Estado de Derecho. Al mismo tiempo, reafirmamos que nuestra postura se orienta siempre a la defensa del pueblo venezolano, cuyos derechos y dignidad deben situarse en el centro de cualquier consideración internacional. El escenario de tensión, como el que estamos observando, no nos hace olvidar el prolongado deterioro de las instituciones, las restricciones a los derechos civiles y políticos y la falta de espacios efectivos de participación democrática. A ello se suma una grave crisis humanitaria y migratoria que se ha convertido en una de las mayores situaciones de desplazamiento del mundo contemporáneo. Millones de venezolanas y venezolanos se han visto forzados a abandonar su país en busca de seguridad, atención básica y oportunidades, generando enormes desafíos humanitarios tanto dentro de Venezuela como en los países de acogida de la región, incluido el nuestro. En este contexto, Chile desea subrayar de manera especial los riesgos que implicaría cualquier escalada militar o conflicto armado. Una confrontación de esta naturaleza tendría consecuencias humanitarias devastadoras, profundizaría el sufrimiento de la población civil y agravaría aún más las dinámicas de desplazamiento, inseguridad y vulnerabilidad. Cualquier diferencia debe abordarse exclusivamente a través de medios pacíficos, en estricto respeto del derecho internacional, la soberanía de los Estados y la prohibición del uso o la amenaza de la fuerza. Señor Presidente, frente a este escenario complejo, Chile considera valioso el papel que pueden desempeñar los mecanismos multilaterales de diálogo y prevención. En ese espíritu, vemos con especial atención el rol de las Naciones Unidas y, en particular, el papel que pueden jugar el Secretario General y este mismo Consejo, con el consentimiento de las partes pertinentes para contribuir a la reducción de tensiones y a la búsqueda de entendimientos que favorezcan una salida pacífica y sostenible. El liderazgo prudente y la experiencia acumulada por nuestra organización pueden ser un apoyo relevante para evitar un mayor deterioro de la situación y para mantener abiertos los canales de comunicación. Señor Presidente, nuestra convicción es clara. Los desafíos que enfrenta Venezuela no tienen una solución militar. Solo podrán abordarse mediante procesos pacíficos, graduales e inclusivos, que consideren las legítimas aspiraciones del pueblo venezolano y prioricen la protección de la población civil. Chile reitera su disposición a respaldar iniciativas constructivas que apunten en esa dirección y a trabajar junto a los países de la región y a la comunidad internacional en favor de la estabilidad, el entendimiento mutuo y el respeto de los principios que sustentan esta organización. Gracias, Presidente.
I thank the representative of Chile for the statement and I give the floor to the representative of Argentina.
Buenas tardes. La República Argentina agradece a la Presidencia de Eslovenia por la convocatoria de esta sesión informativa. Señor Presidente, la Argentina desea expresar que una vez más su profunda preocupación por la grave situación en Venezuela. Como ha manifestado en distintos foros, la Argentina considera que el régimen ilegítimo de Nicolás Maduro ha sumido a Venezuela en una grave crisis política, humanitaria y social, cuyos efectos trascienden el ámbito interno y repercuten negativamente en la estabilidad de América Latina y el Caribe. La persistencia de la impunidad y el debilitamiento del Estado de Derecho en Venezuela, la desestabilización política e institucional y la proyección del crimen organizado transnacional constituyen una amenaza concreta para la seguridad del hemisferio. Desde el inicio de la gestión del presidente Milei, la Argentina ha condenado con firmeza lo que está ocurriendo en Venezuela: la falta de libertad, la violación sistemática de derechos humanos, las detenciones ilegales y la desaparición forzada de opositores políticos, ciudadanos venezolanos y extranjeros, e incluso de niños y adolescentes. La paz, la libertad y la democracia en América Latina han sido puestas en jaque por un régimen carente de legitimidad política, que no permite elecciones libres ni democráticas y que desconoce la voluntad soberana del pueblo venezolano, expresada de manera contundente en las urnas en favor de Edmundo González Urrutia, a quien la Argentina reconoce como presidente electo en Venezuela. Señor presidente, la ocasión amerita recordar que Venezuela se encuentra suspendida del Mercosur desde 2017 por violar el protocolo de Ushuaia sobre compromiso democrático. El mismo establece la democracia como condición esencial para la integración regional, permitiendo la suspensión de cualquier Estado miembro en caso de ruptura del orden democrático o constitucional y aplicando sanciones automáticas para proteger los valores y el Estado de Derecho en la región. El restablecimiento del orden democrático y el respeto irrestricto de los derechos humanos en Venezuela se vuelven imprescindibles. En este contexto, el presidente Milei, en el marco de la cumbre de Mercosur del 20 de diciembre pasado, expresó: Argentina saluda a la presión de los Estados Unidos para liberar al pueblo venezolano. Tampoco puede haber verdadera seguridad en América Latina mientras la vida, la libertad y la estabilidad de nuestros países se vean permanentemente amenazadas por el narcotráfico, el terrorismo y el crimen transnacional organizado. Estas redes se sostienen y se expanden gracias al amparo, la complicidad y la connivencia de regímenes como el que hoy impera en Venezuela. Por último, señor presidente, la Argentina subraya la responsabilidad de la comunidad internacional de pronunciarse con claridad y determinación frente al régimen de Maduro, exigir la liberación de los presos políticos, entre ellos el ciudadano argentino Nahuel Gallo, quien continúa detenido ilegalmente en Venezuela desde el 8 de diciembre de 2024, y garantizar el retorno de la libertad, la democracia, el respeto de los derechos humanos y la prosperidad económica en Venezuela. Solo de esta manera habrá verdadera paz en la región. Muchas gracias.
I thank the representative of Argentina for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Señor presidente, agradezco la convocatoria de esta reunión de emergencia del Consejo de Seguridad y el briefing que nos proporcionó el secretario general asistente Khaled Kiari. Brasil es un firme promotor y defensor de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas, del multilateralismo y de la solución pacífica de controversias. También somos un vecino y amigo de Venezuela, con la que compartimos una extensa frontera terrestre y fuertes lazos históricos, sociales y económicos. Como en todas las cuestiones que este Consejo trata, el parámetro imperativo de su acción debe ser la Carta de las Naciones Unidas, en particular sus principios y disposiciones sobre la paz y la seguridad internacionales. Entre esos principios, la Carta establece la obligación jurídicamente exigible de no usar ni amenazar con usar la fuerza en contra de la integridad territorial o la independencia política de ningún Estado, sin perjuicio de lo dispuesto en el artículo 51 relativo al derecho de legítima defensa. Estos principios y disposiciones son vinculantes para todos los Estados miembros. No admiten excepciones basadas en intereses o proyectos ideológicos, geopolíticos, políticos, económicos o de cualquier otra índole. Tampoco admiten excepciones relacionadas con quejas o demandas de un Estado contra otro, que deben resolverse pacíficamente, incluso recurriendo a la Corte Internacional de Justicia, órgano principal de las Naciones Unidas. Es igualmente incompatible con la Carta cualquier perturbación del comercio internacional de un Estado miembro mediante el uso, la amenaza y el uso de la fuerza sin la debida y formal autorización de este Consejo. Como ha seguidamente subrayado el gobierno brasileño, las medidas coercitivas unilaterales no tienen respaldo en la Carta de las Naciones Unidas y mucho menos pueden ejecutarse mediante el uso o la amenaza de uso de la fuerza. Las soluciones basadas en la fuerza son totalmente contrarias a la mejor tradición y a la opción firme, universal e irreversible por la paz que han adoptado América Latina y el Caribe. Somos y queremos seguir siendo una región de paz, respetuosa del derecho internacional y de las buenas relaciones entre vecinos. Señor presidente, en vista de lo anterior, la fuerza militar reunida y mantenida por los Estados Unidos en las proximidades de Venezuela y el bloqueo naval recientemente anunciado constituyen violaciones de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas. Por lo tanto, deben cesar de inmediato e incondicionalmente en favor del uso de los instrumentos políticos y jurídicos de amplia disponibilidad. Brasil invita a ambos países a un diálogo genuino, de buena fe y sin coerción. Como ya declaró públicamente el presidente Lula, Su gobierno estará dispuesto a colaborar de ser necesario y con el consentimiento mutuo de Estados Unidos y Venezuela. Brasil también estará dispuesto a apoyar cualquier esfuerzo del secretario general en la misma dirección. El asunto que nos reúne hoy no interesa solo a los países de América Latina y el Caribe. Concierne a toda la comunidad internacional, ya que en última instancia el estallido de un conflicto en la región podría tener repercusiones a escala global. Es responsabilidad del Consejo de Seguridad, de todos sus miembros y de todos los estados amantes de la paz esforzarse incansablemente, sin temor u otras motivaciones, para garantizar que las diferencias que hoy debatimos se resuelvan pacíficamente. Muchas gracias.
I thank the representative of Brazil for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Paraguay.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. La delegación de la República del Paraguay agradece a la presidencia y a los miembros del Consejo la oportunidad de tomar la palabra. El que nos ocupa hoy es un tema de gran relevancia y delicadeza, en especial por los esfuerzos que realiza la región, tanto en el sostenimiento de los gobiernos democráticamente elegidos, como en la lucha contra el crimen organizado transnacional, el lavado de activos, la trata de personas, el cibercrimen y el narcotráfico, que se cobran un sinnúmero de vidas inocentes y destruyen comunidades enteras en nuestro continente y en el mundo. La democracia, apreciados colegas, se construye día a día. Por ello, no podemos olvidar la situación que atraviesa Venezuela, cuya crisis migratoria y de seguridad desafían la capacidad de respuesta de nuestros países e incluso la estabilidad de toda la región. Hay que ser claros, el sufrimiento del pueblo venezolano es consecuencia directa de las acciones y medidas del régimen que gobierna ese país y no de factores externos o de terceros. El retorno de la institucionalidad democrática en ese país y la posibilidad de que las autoridades legítimamente electas asuman sus funciones constituirían un acto de justicia y un paso fundamental para la estabilidad regional. En ese sentido, el Paraguay desea expresar con absoluta claridad que no acompañaremos ni secundaremos acciones que pongan en riesgo la democracia, el respeto a los derechos humanos ni el orden constitucional en nuestra región. Nuestro compromiso es y seguirá siendo con los principios democráticos, el Estado de Derecho y la paz social. Señor presidente, en Oslo, hace apenas unas semanas, el Paraguay estuvo presente al más alto nivel en la ceremonia del Premio Nobel de la Paz, acompañando a los familiares de María Corina Machado. La causa venezolana es una que nos toca profundamente, ya que es un pueblo que ha visto sus derechos y libertades fundamentales decimados bajo un régimen dictatorial cruento. Venezuela no es un problema de los venezolanos solamente, sino que es y debe ser un problema del mundo entero y en especial de la región. Manifestamos así nuestra solidaridad con María Corina y a través de ella a todo el pueblo venezolano. Estamos seguros de que la paz y la libertad llegarán a Venezuela más temprano que tarde. Señor presidente, finalmente subrayamos que la lucha contra el crimen organizado debe continuar realizándose en el marco del derecho internacional humanitario y con articulación de los mecanismos de defensa de la democracia, los principios fundamentales del derecho internacional, así como la protección y la promoción irrestrictas de los derechos humanos y de las libertades fundamentales. Todos ellos, elementos esenciales para el proceso de integración regional, el desarrollo y la prosperidad. El Paraguay continuará trabajando en colaboración con todos los actores regionales con quienes compartimos estos valores de democracia y paz. Gracias, señor presidente.
I thank the representative of Paraguay for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Mexico.
Señor presidente, México da la bienvenida a esta sesión del Consejo de Seguridad para examinar la situación derivada de las crecientes tensiones en torno a Venezuela. Cuando la paz internacional se ve amenazada, corresponde a este Consejo asumir su responsabilidad y actuar, siempre en estricto apego al derecho internacional. América Latina y el Caribe se han caracterizado históricamente por ser una zona de paz, construida sobre la base del respeto mutuo, la solución pacífica de las controversias y la proscripción del uso y la amenaza de la fuerza. La reciente escalada de tensiones y el despliegue de fuerzas militares en el sur del Mar Caribe representan actos que ponen en riesgo la estabilidad regional. Es imperativo preservar nuestro espacio de convivencia pacífica, no solo como aspiración regional, sino como una contribución concreta y valiosa a la paz internacional. Conforme al artículo 2 de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas, ninguna diferencia entre estados debe resolverse mediante la amenaza o el uso de la fuerza. La historia demuestra que la amenaza o el uso de la fuerza conducen invariablemente a mayor sufrimiento humano y a la erosión del orden jurídico internacional. Con base en los principios constitucionales de política exterior de México, en particular la no intervención, la solución pacífica de controversias, la proscripción de la amenaza o el uso de la fuerza en las relaciones internacionales y la lucha por la paz y la seguridad internacionales, reiteramos firmemente que sin importar del país o región de que se trate, el diálogo y la negociación son las únicas vías legítimas y eficaces para resolver en el largo plazo las diferencias existentes. Desde 2019, el Estado mexicano ha mantenido una postura firme en favor de una solución pacífica, democrática y negociada para la situación en Venezuela, siempre en un marco de irrestricto respeto a los derechos humanos. Conforme a los principios constitucionales de nuestra política exterior, México reitera que corresponde exclusivamente al pueblo venezolano determinar su futuro político. Por ello, hacemos un llamado inequívoco y urgente a todas las partes a privilegiar los canales diplomáticos, actuar con contención, con cautela y evitar medidas que puedan agravar la situación. En momentos en los que está a prueba el valor del multilateralismo y el de la propia ONU, resulta indispensable recurrir a los mecanismos previstos en el artículo 33 de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas, orientados a la prevención de conflictos y a las soluciones pacíficas de las controversias. Esperamos también que este Consejo pueda orientar y encauzar estos esfuerzos de paz en cumplimiento de su mandato. Instamos también al secretario general a hacer uso de sus buenos oficios para contribuir a desescalar las tensiones, promover la confianza entre las partes, facilitar el diálogo y a generar condiciones que permitan una solución pacífica, sostenible y conforme al derecho internacional. Señor presidente, finalmente, y como lo ha manifestado ya de manera pública la presidenta Claudia Sheinbaum, México reitera su disposición a apoyar, como lo hemos hecho en el pasado, y en caso de que se le solicite, cualquier esfuerzo de facilitación del diálogo, mediación o acompañamiento que contribuya a preservar la paz regional y evitar una confrontación cuyas consecuencias son imprevisibles. Muchas gracias.
I thank the representative of Mexico for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Cuba.
Gracias, señor presidente. Señor presidente, hace apenas 8 días, Cuba denunció en este órgano la peligrosa escalada de agresiones del gobierno de los Estados Unidos contra la República Bolivariana de Venezuela, que constituye una flagrante violación de los propósitos y principios de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas y en particular del artículo 2 en lo que respecta a la igualdad soberana de los Estados, la prohibición de la amenaza o uso de la fuerza, la no intervención en asuntos internos y el arreglo de las controversias internacionales por medios pacíficos. Igualmente, quebranta numerosas resoluciones de la Asamblea General de las Naciones Unidas, especialmente la 2625 sobre los principios del derecho internacional referentes a las relaciones de amistad y a la cooperación entre los Estados, la 3314 que define el bloqueo de los puertos o de las costas de un Estado por las Fuerzas Armadas de otro como un acto de agresión, la 2131 sobre la inadmisibilidad de la intervención en los asuntos internos de los Estados y la protección de su independencia y soberanía, las resoluciones 79/144 y 80/110 que refieren la seguridad y protección del transporte marítimo y la libertad de navegación, así como las resoluciones pertinentes de la Organización Marítima Internacional. Asimismo, contravienen numerosas resoluciones de la ONU sobre las medidas para eliminar el terrorismo internacional y las del Consejo de Seguridad relativas a las amenazas de la paz y la seguridad internacionales causadas por actos terroristas. En menos de un mes, las Fuerzas Armadas de Estados Unidos han cometido varios actos de piratería y terrorismo marítimo contra buques petroleros y su tripulación en aguas internacionales del Mar Caribe, a lo que se suma la declaración de un bloqueo naval contra Venezuela. La actuación irresponsable del gobierno estadounidense parece no tener límites. Impone la aplicación de la ley fuera de su territorio y lejos de sus costas, donde no tiene jurisdicción, utilizando el asalto y la apropiación de bienes. Esto se inscribe en la escalada de Estados Unidos para impedir el legítimo derecho de Venezuela a utilizar y comercializar libremente sus recursos naturales con otras naciones, incluidos los suministros de hidrocarburos a Cuba. Estas acciones repercuten negativamente en Cuba y recrudecen la política de máxima presión y asfixia económica de Estados Unidos, con un impacto directo en el sistema energético nacional y, por consiguiente, en la vida diaria de nuestro pueblo. Reiteramos que el gobierno de Estados Unidos irrespeta y viola gravemente el derecho internacional, el régimen establecido en el derecho del mar, la libertad de navegación y comercio y el convenio para la represión de actos ilícitos contra la seguridad de la navegación marítima. Como si no le fuera suficiente, de manera arbitraria, fraudulenta, unilateral y políticamente motivada, Estados Unidos designó al gobierno legítimo de Venezuela como organización terrorista extranjera. Se ratifica la falta de credibilidad de estas decisiones y la manipulación del terrorismo como un arma política. ¿Qué moral tiene el gobierno de Estados Unidos para estas designaciones cuando protege y financia organizaciones terroristas en su territorio, se niega a colaborar con países vecinos como Cuba en materia de terrorismo y habla abiertamente de acciones encubiertas y sabotajes de la CIA contra infraestructuras venezolanas? Solo persiguen aislar internacionalmente a la revolución bolivariana y chavista, aumentar la presión, escalar en una agresión con impredecibles consecuencias para la paz, la seguridad y la estabilidad de América Latina y el Caribe, y ampliar el exiguo apoyo a sus ataques ilegales. Resulta hipócrita que el país con el principal mercado de drogas en el mundo, desde cuyo territorio se financia este criminal negocio, promueva una guerra para supuestamente combatir ese flagelo en América Latina y el Caribe. Es claro que su propósito es justificar el costoso y extraordinario despliegue militar en la región con el que pretende agredir a Venezuela e impone su dominio hegemónico en el hemisferio. Alertamos a la comunidad internacional de estas provocaciones que buscan escalar aún más la agresión contra territorio venezolano y apoderarse de sus recursos naturales. Venezuela y cualquier otro Estado agredido tiene derecho a la legítima defensa conforme al artículo 51 de la Carta. Todo esto se suma a las medidas coercitivas unilaterales, la asfixia económica, las campañas de descrédito y los ataques contra importantes instituciones de este país que forman parte de la guerra psicológica y el aumento de las presiones por parte del gobierno de Estados Unidos para derrocar al gobierno venezolano. Señor presidente, la nueva estrategia de seguridad nacional de Estados Unidos, que incluye el llamado corolario Trump a la doctrina Monroe, pretende hacer cumplir la idea de que el hemisferio occidental es su zona exclusiva de influencia, valida la peligrosa doctrina de la paz a través de la fuerza y consagra la guerra cognitiva como política de Estado. Refleja en sí misma los enormes desafíos que enfrenta la humanidad y en particular la región latinoamericana y caribeña. El actual gobierno estadounidense y su proyección hacia la región transgrede los preceptos de la proclama de América Latina y el Caribe como zona de paz. La política del gran garrote y la diplomacia de las cañoneras, con su criminal prontuario de agresiones y atropellos contra los pueblos, pertenece al pasado de nuestra región. No podemos permitir que sea el futuro. Reiteramos el llamado a la comunidad internacional a detener esta escalada contra un Estado soberano. El despliegue naval ostensible, exagerado e injustificado de las fuerzas estadounidenses en el Mar Caribe, junto a la deliberada amenaza de agresión militar contra la nación bolivariana, tiene consecuencias impredecibles para la estabilidad política, social y económica de toda la región. Ello revela un propósito hegemónico y criminal y requiere una condena universal. Señor presidente, rechazamos la prórroga de sanciones y medidas coercitivas unilaterales de la Unión Europea contra Venezuela, contrarias al derecho internacional y la Carta de las Naciones Unidas, que buscan aumentar la presión contra el gobierno venezolano y se alinean a los intereses agresivos y neocolonialistas estadounidenses. Cuba reafirma su total y firme apoyo al presidente constitucional Nicolás Maduro, a la revolución bolivariana y chavista y a su unión cívico-militar. Demandamos el respeto irrestricto a la soberanía, la independencia y el derecho de Venezuela a decidir libremente su destino sin injerencias externas. No es la primera vez que se intenta someter a América Latina y el Caribe bajo pretensiones hegemónicas. Estamos convencidos que no será tampoco la última en que los pueblos de la región sepan determinar su futuro y abogar por su legítimo derecho a vivir en paz. Muchas gracias.
I thank the representative of Cuba for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Nicaragua.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Nicaragua expresa su plena y permanente solidaridad inquebrantable, fraterna y militante con el gobierno constitucional del presidente Nicolás Maduro Moros. Con ustedes siempre, compañeros y compañeras. Con el pueblo chavista y bolivariano y con las Fuerzas Armadas Nacional Bolivarianas de Venezuela. La soberanía e integridad territorial de Venezuela se respeta. Es parte integral de nuestra América Latina y caribeña. Su lucha es nuestra lucha. Reconocemos su inquebrantable resistencia frente a la maquinaria imperial y honramos la memoria del comandante Hugo Chávez, cuyo legado de soberanía y unidad late con fuerza en el corazón de toda la patria grande. Reafirmamos nuestra solidaridad inquebrantable con el gobierno y pueblo venezolano, que resisten ante las amenazas y ataques del imperialismo. Su lucha por la paz, la justicia y el derecho a construir su propio destino es una causa que asumimos como propia. Señor presidente, Nicaragua denuncia categóricamente los actos de piratería moderna, en este caso, el saqueo de los recursos de Venezuela. Denunciamos que estos robos, el secuestro de buques petroleros y el despojo de activos financieros atentan contra la soberanía del pueblo de Venezuela y constituyen un peligroso atentado contra la paz y la estabilidad de toda la región de América Latina y el Caribe, con consecuencias que impactan catastróficamente en el comercio y la navegación mundial. Condenamos enérgicamente las agresiones y hostilidades continuas e intensificadas hacia Venezuela, que se han traducido en un bloqueo económico criminal y en una guerra híbrida diseñada para infligir el máximo sufrimiento a su población civil. Estas acciones deliberadas buscan provocar el colapso de una nación soberana para imponer por la fuerza, intimidación y la hambruna un gobierno dócil y servil al servicio de intereses egoístas foráneos. Exigimos el cese inmediato del despliegue militar de Estados Unidos en nuestra región de América Latina y el Caribe. Esta presencia militar pirata es una amenaza directa a la seguridad de nuestras naciones. Estas políticas de agresión son un descarado acto para cambiar gobiernos legítima y democráticamente electos. Demandamos poner fin a las acciones imperialistas y colonizadoras de los Estados Unidos en nuestra región. E instamos a la comunidad internacional a preservar y respetar el espíritu y los principios fundamentales de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas, tales como abstenerse de recurrir a la amenaza o al uso de la fuerza contra la integridad territorial e independencia política de cualquier Estado, la no intervención, la solución pacífica de controversia y la igualdad soberana de los Estados. Señor presidente, las y los venezolanos quieren paz. Exigimos que se respete la dignidad y soberanía de su país, su derecho inalienable a comercializar sus recursos naturales libremente, y pedimos que se ponga fin de manera inmediata a todas las medidas coercitivas unilaterales y ilegales, las cuales socavan la estabilidad de la región y constituyen un castigo colectivo prohibido por el derecho internacional. Nicaragua se une al llamado del presidente constitucional Nicolás Maduro Moros y a los líderes y lideresas del mundo con conciencia para condenar estos hechos e instar a activar todos los mecanismos multilaterales necesarios para investigar, sancionar y prevenir estos actos de piratería y agresión económica. El Consejo de Seguridad y Naciones Unidas, la ONU, tiene obligación de salvaguardar la paz y seguridades internacionales. No pueden ser espectadora pasiva del saqueo de un país miembro. Nicaragua sabe que la unidad de los pueblos es más poderosa que las pretensiones hegemónicas imperiales. La solidaridad con Venezuela es un deber moral y una obligación política para quienes forjamos este mundo multipolar, justo y soberano. Reafirmamos que Nicaragua caminará junto a nuestras hermanas y hermanos venezolanos en la defensa de su patria. Venezuela no está sola. Para terminar, señor presidente, reafirmamos que la defensa de la soberanía venezolana es la defensa de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas, del derecho internacional, del principio de no intervención y autodeterminación, del derecho de todos los pueblos a construir su propio destino sin coerciones extranjeras, sin amenazas o uso de la fuerza en las relaciones internacionales. Muchas gracias.
I thank the representative of Nicaragua for the statement. The representative of the United States has asked for the floor to make a further statement.
Thank you, Mr. President. The illegitimate Maduro regime has displayed little to no political will to counter drug-related threats and curb drug